Millionaire mocks black maid's broken English. She responds in 12 languages and shocks everyone. The cruel laughter echoed through the marble halls of the Westfield Manor like thunder before a storm. Jonathan Westfield, heir to a $480 million real estate empire, had just delivered what he considered the wittiest insult of his privileged life to the woman who had been cleaning his mansion for 5 years. "Elena, sweetheart," Jonathan sneered, swirling his vintage wine while his dinner guests chuckled appreciatively. "Could you speak proper English for once? This isn't the barrio. We don't understand your broken pidgin here." But what Jonathan Westfield didn't know, what his arrogance and prejudice had blinded him to for half a decade, was that Elena Martinez wasn't just a maid who struggled with English. Hidden beneath her humble uniform was one of the most brilliant linguistic minds of her generation, a woman who had once stood before the United Nations General Assembly, translating critical international negotiations in real time. Elena Martinez had been invisible for 5 years, enduring daily humiliations while supporting her family and planning her return to the career that had been stolen from her by circumstances beyond her control. Tonight, that invisibility was about to end in the most spectacular way imaginable. As Jonathan's guests continued their mocking laughter, Elena calmly set down her cleaning supplies and looked directly into the eyes of the man who had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The silence that followed would shatter more than just assumptions. It would demolish an entire worldview built on linguistic supremacy and cultural ignorance. "Mr. Westfield," Elena said, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the room pause, "I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about who exactly needs lessons in communication." The Westfield Manor stood like a monument to inherited wealth in the heart of Beverly Hills, its Italian marble facade reflecting the California sunset like polished gold. For 5 years, Elena Martinez had walked through its opulent halls carrying cleaning supplies, invisible to the family whose fortune had been built on luxury real estate developments across 3 continents. Jonathan Westfield, 42, had never worked a day in his life, but had perfected the art of inherited superiority. Tonight, he was hosting what he called his International Investment Circle, a group of wealthy socialites who gathered monthly to discuss acquisition opportunities while demonstrating their supposed worldliness through casual bigotry, disguised as sophisticated commentary. "The problem with these immigrants," Jonathan was explaining to his guests while Elena cleaned the crystal chandelier above them, "is that they simply refuse to assimilate. Take our maid here, 5 years in America, and she still can't speak proper English." Elena paused in her work, her experienced hands steady on the delicate crystal despite the familiar sting of humiliation. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times, always spoken as if she were invisible, as if her presence was no more significant than the furniture she dusted. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a prominent Beverly Hills physician, nodded in agreement. "It's quite frustrating when you're trying to give instructions and they look at you with those blank stares. The language barrier is really quite problematic." "Elena understands enough to follow orders," laughed Patricia Blackwood, adjusting her diamond necklace. "Though I must say, Jonathan, you have remarkable patience with her broken English attempts." What these affluent guests didn't know was that Elena understood every nuanced word of their conversation, not just in English, but in the 3 other languages they occasionally peppered into their speech to demonstrate their supposed sophistication. She recognized Dr. Thornton's butchered French pronunciation, Patricia's elementary German phrases, and Jonathan's laughably incorrect Italian expressions that he used to impress his dinner companions. Elena Martinez had been born in Colombia to a family of educators. Her father had been a literature professor, her mother a linguistics researcher. By age 12, Elena was fluent in Spanish, English, French, and Portuguese. By 16, she had added Italian, German, and Mandarin Chinese to her repertoire. Her gift for languages had earned her a full scholarship to Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, where she had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in international relations and applied linguistics. But tonight's guests knew none of this. To them, Elena was simply the help, a woman whose accent marked her as inferior, whose broken English confirmed their assumptions about intellectual capacity and social worth. The real issue, continued Richard Morrison, a real estate mogul from New York, is that they cluster in their little ethnic enclaves and never learn to speak like Americans. It's cultural laziness, pure and simple. Elena's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on her cleaning cloth. For 5 years, she had endured these conversations while secretly supporting her teenage daughter's pre-med studies at UCLA and sending money to her elderly parents in Bogota. For 5 years, she had been saving every penny to reclaim the career that had been interrupted when her husband's sudden death had left her stranded in America with a young child and no legal work authorization. "Elena," Jonathan called loudly, as if volume could bridge the supposed language barrier. "Could you bring us more wine? And this time, try to understand. Vino, wine, the red bottles." The condescension in his voice was so thick it seemed to pollute the very air. Elena nodded with practiced subservience, but something had shifted in her expression, a subtle change that spoke of a decision being made, a line being crossed. As she walked toward the wine cellar, Elena passed a mirror in the hallway and caught sight of herself. For a moment she saw not the invisible domestic worker these people perceived, but Dr. Elena Martinez, the woman who had once translated confidential negotiations between heads of state, who had been personally commended by the UN Secretary General for her work during the Syrian peace talks, who had been featured on the cover of International Diplomatic Review as one of the rising stars of global communication. That woman had been dormant for 5 years. Tonight, she was about to resurface. When Elena returned with the wine, Jonathan was in the middle of what he clearly considered a brilliant monologue about linguistic assimilation and the immigrant mentality. "The truth is," he was saying while Elena filled his glass, "these people simply lack the intellectual capacity for proper English pronunciation. It's not entirely their fault. Some cultures just don't develop the sophisticated linguistic structures necessary for clear communication." Elena finished pouring and stepped back, but instead of retreating to continue her cleaning, she remained standing beside the table. The guests looked up at her with mild annoyance, clearly expecting her to disappear back into the invisible background where they preferred their service workers to remain. "Mr. Westfield," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made everyone pause their conversations. "What is it, Elena?" Jonathan replied with exaggerated patience, speaking slowly and loudly as if addressing a child. "Do you need help understanding something?" "Actually," Elena replied, her voice growing stronger, "I was wondering if you could help me understand something." The table fell silent. In 5 years, Elena had never initiated a conversation beyond acknowledging instructions or answering direct questions. "You've spent the last hour discussing linguistic assimilation and cultural adaptation," Elena continued, her English suddenly noticeably clearer and more precise. "I'm curious about your qualifications to make such assessments." Jonathan's eyebrows shot up. "My qualifications? Elena, I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," Elena interrupted, and the authority in her voice made Patricia Blackwood's wine glass freeze halfway to her lips. "I understand that you believe my accent indicates intellectual inferiority. I understand that you assume my pronunciation reflects my cognitive capacity. I understand that you've spent 5 years speaking about me as if I were furniture." The room had gone completely silent. Dr. Thornton exchanged worried glances with Richard Morrison, while Jonathan's face was beginning to show the first signs of confusion mixed with irritation. "Elena, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Jonathan began. La única confusión aquí es que ustedes asumen que el acento equivale a ignorancia, Elena said smoothly in perfect Spanish, watching as every face around the table registered shock. Which translates to, she continued in flawless English, the only confusion here is that you assume accent equals ignorance. If this story of hidden brilliance and the prejudices that blind us to linguistic genius is already touching your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Because what Elena is about to reveal will challenge everything you think you know about intelligence, language, and the people society teaches us to overlook. The silence that followed Elena's Spanish declaration was so profound that the gentle ticking of the antique grandfather clock seemed to echo like thunder through the mansion's dining room. Jonathan Westfield stared at his maid with the expression of a man whose entire worldview had just been shaken to its foundation. Did she just? Patricia Blackwood whispered, her diamond-adorned hand pressed to her chest in shock. Speak perfect Spanish? Yes, Elena replied calmly. But perhaps you'd prefer French? She turned to Dr. Thornton, whose earlier attempts at French pronunciation had been particularly grating. Dr. Thornton, votre accent français est, comment dit-on, épouvantable. Vous massacrez une belle langue. Dr. Thornton's face went pale. Even with her limited French, she understood enough to recognize that Elena had just critiqued her pronunciation with surgical precision. For those who don't speak French, Elena continued conversationally, I informed Dr. Thornton that her French accent is atrocious and that she's massacring a beautiful language. Richard Morrison leaned forward, his business instincts telling him that something extraordinary was happening. How many languages do you speak? Elena smiled, and for the first time in 5 years, it was a smile of genuine confidence rather than practiced subservience. Would you like the complete list, or shall I demonstrate? Without waiting for an answer, she continued, Ich spreche fließend Deutsch, wie Sie hören können. Her German was flawless, carrying the precise articulation of someone educated in formal linguistic structure. Parlo italiano meglio di lei, Signor Westfield, she added, her Italian pronunciation making Jonathan's earlier attempts sound like a tourist fumbling through a phrasebook. Woda Zhongwen Yehan Liu Li, she said in Mandarin, the tonal complexities rolling off her tongue with native speaker precision. Я также свободно говорю по-русски, she continued in Russian, before adding Portuguese. E o português é minha segunda língua nativa. The dinner guests sat in stunned silence as Elena continued her linguistic tour de force, switching effortlessly between Arabic, Japanese, and Hindi, each language delivered with the fluency and cultural nuance that comes only from years of serious study and practical application. Jonathan's face had progressed through several shades of red and was now approaching purple. How is this possible? He stammered. You work as a maid, Elena finished for him. Yes, Mr. Westfield. For the past 5 years, I've been cleaning your house, washing your dishes, and listening to you and your friends discuss my supposed intellectual limitations. She walked slowly around the table, her posture transforming from the deferential stance of domestic service to the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect. But before I was your maid, I was Dr. Elena Martinez, Senior Translator for the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. I held a top-secret security clearance and served as the primary interpreter for confidential negotiations involving heads of state from 12 different countries. The transformation was remarkable. With each word, Elena seemed to shed the invisible cloak that had shrouded her for 5 years. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had translated life and death decisions in real time, whose linguistic precision had helped prevent international conflicts. You translated for the UN? Dr. Thornton asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For 8 years, Elena confirmed. I was the lead Spanish-English interpreter during the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis negotiations. I translated for the Colombian peace process meetings. I was personally selected by Secretary General Antonio Guterres to interpret the closed-door sessions during the Syrian refugee summit. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a worn leather folder. Would you like to see my credentials, Mr. Westfield? Or perhaps you'd prefer to hear about the time I translated for President Macron, Chancellor Merkel, and Prime Minister Trudeau during the Climate Accords emergency session? Jonathan's world was collapsing around him. But you're a maid. You clean toilets. You're English. My English has always been perfect, Elena replied with devastating calm. What you've been hearing for 5 years isn't broken English, Mr. Westfield. It's exhaustion. It's the speech pattern of someone working 16-hour days to support her family while hiding her true identity to protect her undocumented status. The room erupted in whispered conversations as the guests struggled to process this revelation. Richard Morrison pulled out his phone, undoubtedly Googling Elena's name and credentials. I don't understand, Patricia Blackwood said weakly. If you're so educated, so accomplished, why are you working as domestic help? Elena's expression softened, revealing a glimpse of the pain she had carried for 5 years. Because 5 years ago, my husband Carlos was killed in a car accident while working his second job as a night security guard. He was the one with legal work authorization. His death left me and my daughter Maria undocumented and vulnerable. She walked to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens she had helped maintain. I had to choose between returning to Colombia with nothing or staying in America to give my daughter a chance at the education she deserved. So I became invisible. I took whatever work I could find that didn't require documentation checks. But your UN credentials, Dr. Thornton began, are worthless without legal status, Elena replied. Do you think the State Department hires undocumented translators for classified briefings? I've been cleaning houses and sending every penny to keep Maria at UCLA pre-med while I saved enough money to fix my immigration status. Jonathan had been silent for several minutes, his privileged worldview crumbling with each revelation. You've been planning this, he said finally. This demonstration. Elena turned back to face him, her dark eyes holding 5 years of accumulated dignity. No, Mr. Westfield, I've been enduring this. Tonight was simply the night I decided I'd had enough of being invisible. She began removing her apron, folding it with the same precision she had once used to organize classified diplomatic documents. You see, last week I received notification that my immigration attorney has successfully resolved my status issues. As of Monday morning, I will be Dr. Elena Martinez again, not just your maid. Richard Morrison looked up from his phone, his face pale. Elena Martinez, you're the Elena Martinez, the one who prevented the Venezuelan border crisis from escalating into armed conflict. You're mentioned in 3 different diplomatic memoirs. 4, actually, Elena corrected with a slight smile. Ambassador Chen's book comes out next month. The implications of Richard's discovery rippled through the room. These weren't just wealthy socialites anymore. They were people confronting the reality that they had spent 5 years casually dismissing one of the most accomplished linguists in international diplomacy. Why didn't you tell us? Jonathan asked, his voice barely audible. Elena's response cut through the room like a blade. Because you never asked. In 5 years, not one of you ever asked about my background, my education, my family, or my dreams. You saw the uniform and assumed you knew everything worth knowing about me. She placed the folded apron on the table between the wine glasses and expensive china. You assumed my accent meant ignorance. You assumed my cleaning supplies meant I was incapable of intellectual discourse. You assumed that because I needed this job, I deserved your condescension. Patricia Blackwood had tears in her eyes. Elena, we had no idea. That's exactly the problem, Elena replied. You had no idea because you never tried to have an idea. For 5 years I've listened to you discuss politics, international affairs, and cultural issues while treating me like I was too stupid to understand. Meanwhile, I was probably the only person in this room who had actually lived and worked in the situations you were theorizing about. Can you believe what's happening right now? 5 years of hidden brilliance just erupted in the most spectacular way. If this story is making you think differently about the people around you, smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear Elena's powerful message. The dining room of Westfield Manor had become a cathedral of uncomfortable truths, where the golden light of the chandelier Elena had cleaned hundreds of times now illuminated the shattered remnants of 5 years of casual prejudice. Jonathan Westfield sat in his chair like a man who had just watched his entire belief system collapse in real time. "Dr. Martinez," Richard Morrison said slowly, testing the title that suddenly seemed to carry enormous weight. "What are your plans now that your immigration status is resolved?" Elena smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been waiting 5 years to answer that exact question. "Tomorrow morning, I have a video conference with the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. They need a Spanish-Arabic interpreter for the upcoming nuclear non-proliferation talks in Vienna." She paused, letting the magnitude of that statement settle over the room. "Next week, I begin consulting for the State Department on the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis. And next month, I start teaching graduate-level courses in diplomatic translation at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service." Dr. Thornton shook her head in amazement. "You went from cleaning houses to nuclear diplomacy in a matter of days?" "I never left nuclear diplomacy," Elena corrected gently. "I just had to clean houses while waiting for the legal system to restore my right to practice my profession publicly." Jonathan finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Elena, Dr. Martinez, I don't know how to apologize for what I've said, for how I've treated you." Elena studied the man who had casually humiliated her for 5 years, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Westfield, apologies are words. What matters now is whether you've learned something about the danger of assumptions." She walked back to the window, her silhouette framed against the Beverly Hills skyline, where countless other invisible immigrants worked in mansions just like this one. "You know what the greatest irony is? For 5 years, you've hosted these dinner parties where you discuss international affairs with people who have never lived outside their comfortable bubbles. Meanwhile, the person who actually understood the complexities you were debating was invisible to you because she wore a cleaning uniform." Patricia Blackwood stood up, her jewelry catching the light as she moved. How do we make this right?" Elena turned back to face the group, her expression thoughtful. "You can start by remembering this feeling, the shock, the embarrassment, the realization that you've been wrong. Use that feeling the next time you encounter someone whose accent is different, whose job seems menial, whose appearance doesn't match your assumptions about intelligence or worth." She began gathering her personal items from around the room, a process that seemed symbolic of reclaiming her identity. Every domestic worker, every gardener, every person serving you food or cleaning your offices has a story. Some are exactly what they appear to be, and they deserve your respect for that. Others, like me, are temporarily invisible while circumstances force them into survival mode. Richard Morrison had been quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of Elena's revelation. "Dr. Martinez, I own properties in 12 countries. I regularly work with international development projects. Would you consider consulting on cultural sensitivity and communication protocols?" Elena's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's very kind, Mr. Morrison. But I should mention that my consulting rate as a UN-certified diplomatic translator is considerably higher than what you've been paying for housekeeping services." The wry humor in her voice broke some of the tension, and Richard actually smiled. "I imagine it is. and I imagine it's worth every penny." Jonathan had been staring at his hands, the weight of 5 years of casual cruelty settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Dr. Martinez, I need you to know that I will never forget this night, not just because of what you've shown me about yourself, but because of what you've shown me about myself." "What have I shown you about yourself, Mr. Westfield?" Jonathan's voice cracked slightly as he answered, "That I've been a bigot hiding behind sophistication, that I've confused privilege with intelligence and accent with ignorance, that I've spent 5 years being intellectually inferior to someone I considered beneath my notice." Elena nodded slowly. "That's a painful realization, Mr. Westfield, but it's also the beginning of wisdom." She walked to the massive bookshelf that dominated one wall of the dining room, a bookshelf she had dusted countless times while listening to discussions about books these people had never actually read. "You know what I've learned in 5 years of being invisible? Intelligence doesn't announce itself with expensive accents or designer clothes. Wisdom doesn't require a Harvard MBA or a trust fund. And dignity certainly doesn't depend on whether someone recognizes your worth." Dr. Thornton stood up suddenly, her face flushed with emotion. "Dr. Martinez, I work at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. We have a large Hispanic patient population, and communication barriers are a constant challenge. Would you consider developing a cultural competency training program for our medical staff?" "That's exactly the kind of work I'm passionate about," Elena replied. "Healthcare communication can literally be a matter of life and death. I'd be honored to help." As the evening wound down, the transformation in the room was remarkable. The same people who had begun the night casually discussing Elena's supposed intellectual limitations were now competing to offer her professional opportunities that matched her actual qualifications. But Elena wasn't finished. She had one more lesson to deliver. "Before I leave," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had addressed world leaders, "I want you to understand something. This isn't just about me. Right now, tonight, there are thousands of people just like me working in jobs that don't reflect their education or abilities. Refugees who were doctors in their home countries, working as janitors while they navigate credential recognition. Immigrants with advanced degrees driving Uber while they learn the systems that will let them practice their professions." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The next time you interact with someone whose English isn't perfect, whose job seems beneath your social circle, whose appearance doesn't match your assumptions about success, remember tonight. Remember that you might be talking to a former judge, a displaced engineer, a refugee who once ran a hospital." Patricia Blackwood wiped tears from her eyes. "How do we do better? How do we see people like you did?" "You ask questions," Elena replied simply. "You listen to answers. You recognize that everyone has a story, and most of those stories are more complex than you imagine. You treat service workers like human beings with histories, dreams, and capabilities that extend far beyond their current circumstances." Jonathan stood up, his movement uncertain, as if he was learning to walk in a world where his fundamental assumptions had been shattered. "Dr. Martinez, will you accept a personal apology? Not for tonight, but for 5 years of not seeing you." Elena studied his face for a long moment. "Mr. Westfield, I accept your apology, but more importantly, I hope you'll extend that same recognition to others. The real test isn't how you treat me now that you know who I am. The real test is how you treat the next person whose worth isn't immediately obvious to you." As Elena gathered the last of her belongings, she turned back to address the room one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, it has been educational working for you, but Dr. Elena Martinez has diplomatic interpreting to do." She walked toward the door with the bearing of someone who had reclaimed not just her identity, but her dignity. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. "Oh, and Mr. Westfield, your Italian pronunciation really is terrible." If you're going to use foreign phrases to impress people, you might want to learn how to say them correctly. With that final linguistic coup de grace, Dr. Elena Martinez walked out of Westfield Manor and back into the career that had been waiting 5 years for her return. 6 months later, Elena was featured on the cover of Diplomatic Quarterly magazine as the Invisible Interpreter, how one woman's journey from maid to UN consultant challenges our assumptions about hidden talent. Her story sparked a national conversation about immigrant contributions and the danger of linguistic prejudice. Jonathan Westfield used his real estate wealth to establish the Martinez Foundation, which provided legal and financial support for highly educated immigrants navigating credentialing and documentation challenges. His first beneficiary was a Syrian doctor working as a dishwasher while fighting to have his medical credentials recognized. And Elena's daughter Maria graduated from UCLA Medical School summa cum laude, speaking 5 languages fluently and carrying forward her mother's legacy of invisible strength, transforming into visible impact. The cleaning supplies Elena had left behind in Westfield Manor were replaced by new workers whom Jonathan now greeted by name, whose stories he learned, and whose dignity he protected. Because once you've seen how brilliance can hide in plain sight, you never quite look at the world the same way again. If Elena's incredible revelation has inspired you to look at people around you with new eyes, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with everyone who needs to hear this message. Because the next Dr. Elena Martinez might be closer than you think, and the world needs their brilliance to be recognized.